My name is Nadia Osei. I'm 31 years old. And the afternoon Aunt Patricia stood up at the Osei family reunion, tapped the rim of her plastic cup, and said, in front of 42 people, "Honey, cooking for strangers isn't a career plan, it's a phase," was the afternoon I finally understood that some people will only believe in you once the proof is too large to ignore. I didn't put the bread basket down. I didn't turn around. I smoothed the front of my apron with one hand, picked up the basket, and walked back toward the serving table at the far end of the Elmwood Community Center Pavilion. Behind me, I heard Aunt Lisa say, "Her mother worries and she should," and I heard my mother say nothing at all, which, by then, I had learned to read as its own kind of answer. What none of them knew, what I had not told a single person in that building, was that 3 weeks earlier, the office of the governor of the state had sent my company a formal letter of engagement. The inaugural dinner was 8 months away. The deposit had already cleared. I refilled the bread basket. I went back to work. Let me take you back to where this started, because the reunion was not the beginning. It was just the loudest version of something that had been happening since I was 24 years old and made the decision that would define the next 7 years of my life. I grew up in Briarwood, a mid-sized city in the upper Midwest where the Osei family was, by its own accounting, a serious family. My father's side were engineers, accountants, 1 physician, 2 teachers. My mother's side were civil servants, a school principal, a retired military officer. Everyone had a credential that translated directly into a salary, a pension, a clear line from effort to outcome. This was not a family that distrusted hard work. They distrusted work they couldn't explain at a dinner table in under 1 sentence. My father was an electrical engineer. He retired at 62 with a full pension and a firm handshake from a company that had employed him for 31 years. He was a quiet man with a respect for process that bordered on devotion. He did not understand what I was trying to build, but he did not mock it either. He asked questions, the same 2 questions, in a rotating order, and then he listened to the answers with an expression that suggested he was filing them somewhere he would never open again. He loved me. He simply had no framework for me. My mother was different. My mother understood business, in theory. She had run the administrative office of a mid-sized law firm for 19 years. She understood billing, client relations, vendor contracts, the gap between what people charged and what they actually collected. She understood, in other words, exactly enough to be frightened on my behalf. Every conversation about Osei and Table, the catering company I founded at 24 with $8,000 in personal savings and a rented commercial kitchen on the east side of Briarwood, ended with my mother listing the ways it could fail. She was not cruel. She was precise. There is a particular kind of discouragement that comes dressed as information, and my mother had mastered it. Aunt Patricia was my mother's older sister by 4 years. She had worked in human resources for the county government for 26 years and had the specific confidence of someone who has never been wrong in a domain no one can measure. She was not malicious. I want to be clear about that because the story doesn't work if she's a cartoon. Aunt Patricia genuinely believed that the world sorted itself into sensible paths and foolish ones, and that love required you to steer people away from the foolish ones before they lost too much time. She had steered 2 of her own children, my cousins Marcus and Diane, into stable, credential-bearing careers, and she was proud of this. The steering had worked. She had proof. And so she applied the same method to me, the niece who had quit a perfectly reasonable marketing coordinator position at a regional hospital network to cook food for strangers' events. Aunt Lisa was quieter about it. Aunt Lisa's version of doubt was the raised eyebrow held a beat too long, the how's the business going, delivered in a tone that already contained the answer. She was not the engine of the family skepticism. She was the chorus. My mother was somewhere between the 2. Some weeks, she asked genuine questions. Some weeks, she forwarded me job listings with a note that said, "Just in case." I had learned to read her forwarding schedule as a barometer of how a family conversation had gone without me. This was the environment in which I built Osei and Table. Not against it exactly, I did not have the energy for against. I built it alongside it, the way a plant grows toward a window without fighting the wall. I should tell you what the company actually was, because the family's mental image of it was wrong for most of its existence. When I started at 24, it was exactly what Aunt Patricia imagined. Me and a rented kitchen and a folding table at a farmer's market, selling boxed lunches on Saturdays and catering church receptions and small office parties on weeknights. My first year, I cleared $31,000 in revenue and paid myself $14,000. I kept a second job for the first 18 months, event coordinator at a hotel downtown, 3 shifts a week, because $14,000 was not a salary, it was a signal that I was still alive. The second year was better. I hired my first part-time employee, a culinary school graduate named Priya Mehta, who had more technical skill than I did, and was willing to work for what I could afford to pay her, which was not enough, but she believed in where we were going. By the end of year 2, revenue was $87,000. I left the hotel job. I told my mother. She said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and then forwarded me a job listing 2 weeks later. I don't think she remembered she'd done it. Year 3 was the year I made the decision that changed everything, though it did not look like a decision at the time. It looked like a contract. A regional university was expanding its alumni event programming and needed a catering partner for a series of donor dinners, 6 events across one academic year, each between 80 and 120 guests, formal seated service. The contract was worth $214,000. It was the largest number I had ever typed into a proposal document. I submitted the bid on a Thursday night sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold next to my laptop. I had Priya review the food cost projections. I had a small business attorney named Gerald Okafor, no relation, review the contract terms. I was methodical in a way that felt almost ceremonial because I understood that this was the kind of decision you could not half make. We got the contract. We executed all 6 events without a single significant incident. The university's director of alumni relations, a precise, gray-haired woman named Dr. Constance Feld, wrote us a formal letter of commendation at the end of the year. I framed it. It is still on the wall of my office. Year 4, revenue $612,000. Year 5, $1.1 million. We had moved out of the rented kitchen into our own facility, a 3,200 square foot production kitchen on the north side of Briarwood that I leased for $6,400 a month. I had 7 full-time employees and a roster of 12 part-time staff. I had an operations manager, a woman named Comfort Asani, who had 15 years of food service management experience and who ran the floor of every event with a calm authority that I tried to study and absorb. I had accounts with 4 hotels, 2 universities, the County Arts Council, and a corporate campus that hosted 3 to 5 catered events per week. I was, by any external measure, running a real business. The family did not update their mental image. This is the part that took me the longest to understand. It was not that they were withholding credit. It was that the original image, Nadia with her bread baskets and her folding table, Nadia playing house, had calcified. New information came in and slid off it. The revenue numbers I occasionally mentioned were too abstract. The employees were people they'd never met. The university letter meant nothing because they had no reference point for what it cost to win a university contract. The image stayed fixed, Nadia's little catering phase. The reunion was year 5. The pavilion at Elmwood Community Center. 42 family members. Aunt Patricia, with her plastic cup. I refilled the bread basket. I went back to work. The letter from the governor's office had arrived 22 days before the reunion. I want to be specific about this, because the timing matters to what happened next. The background: the state had a new governor. He had won a close election the previous November, and his transition team was organizing the inaugural celebration. The centerpiece was a formal dinner for 300 guests at the State Heritage Hall in the Capitol, 2 hours from Briarwood. The guest list was a cross-section of the state's civic infrastructure: legislators, university presidents, major donors, cabinet members, labor leaders, faith community representatives. It was, by any measure, the highest-profile single-event contract in the state's catering market that year. The transition team had put the contract out to competitive bid. 12 companies submitted proposals. I found out about it through a contact, a hotel events director named Simon Park who had worked with Osei and Table on 3 corporate accounts and who sent me the bid solicitation with a note that said, "This is your lane. Bid it." I spent 3 weeks on the proposal. I revised the menu concept 4 times. I had Gerald Okafor review the contract terms twice. I brought Comfort Asante into every planning conversation because her operational instincts were better than mine on large-format events, and 300 guests at a state ceremony was the largest single event we had ever proposed. The food cost projections were built at 3 levels of contingency. The staffing plan accounted for a 15% no-show rate among part-time staff. I submitted the proposal on a Tuesday morning, and then I went to work a regular day because I had an office party to execute that afternoon and a corporate lunch the following morning, and I did not have the bandwidth to wait. The call came 6 days later. A woman named Nadia Osei, the Inaugural Committee's chief logistics coordinator, told me that Osei and Table had been selected as the exclusive catering partner for the governor's inaugural dinner. The contract value was $487,000. The deposit, 30%, would be processed within 10 business days. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery supply warehouse when she told me this. I said, "Thank you, Andrea. We won't let you down." I ended the call. I sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes. Then I went inside and bought 40 pounds of arborio rice because we had a risotto station to prep for a Friday event. I did not tell my family. I told Priya and Comfort. I told Gerald Okafor so he could review the final contract documents. I told no one else. Not because I was planning something. Because I had learned over 5 years that announcing things to my family before the proof arrived was a version of asking for something I was no longer willing to ask for. The reunion was 3 weeks later. I catered part of it, not under contract, just as a family contribution the way I always did. I brought the bread. I brought the rice dishes. I set up the serving table, and I kept it stocked, and I moved through the pavilion the way I always moved through events, efficiently without drawing attention to myself, watching the room. Aunt Patricia made her toast, if you could call it that, midway through the afternoon. I was at the serving table when she said it. I heard it clearly across the room. Cooking for strangers isn't a career plan. It's a phase. The cup tap. The gentle laughter from the people who were embarrassed not to laugh. Aunt Lisa's agreement. My mother's silence. I picked up the bread basket. I smoothed my apron. I walked back to the serving table, and I thought about the $487,000 deposit that was processing in my business account, and I did not say a word. The 8 months between the reunion and the inaugural dinner were the hardest 8 months of my company's existence, and also the most clarifying. The governor's inaugural dinner was not simply a catering job. It was a logistical construction project in which food was the primary material. The State Heritage Hall had a full commercial kitchen that we had exclusive access to for 48 hours before the event, but the kitchen was configured for banquet-style production, not the plated service the committee had requested. Comfort spent 6 weeks redesigning our workflow around the space. We brought in 2 additional senior staff, a sous chef named Rafael Domingo who had 12 years of hotel fine dining experience, and a floor manager named Kezia Bright who had handled state-level events before and understood the specific tempo of a room full of elected officials and their staffs. The menu went through 6 iterations. Nadia Osei had strong opinions about the protein course. The governor's personal dietary restrictions required a parallel menu for his table that had to be indistinguishable from the main service in its presentation. There were seating logistics, allergen protocols, a timeline that had to synchronize with the program's speaking schedule down to 15-minute windows. I attended 4 planning meetings at the State Heritage Hall. I drove 2 hours each way for each of them. I did not find this remarkable. This was the job. 3 weeks before the event, the Inaugural Committee's press office released a media preview of the celebration details. The release named vendors, venues, and partners. This was standard practice for a state inaugural, meant to generate local business coverage. Osei and Table was listed by full name as the exclusive catering partner. The release went to every regional paper, every local TV affiliate, and the state's 2 major business journals. I did not send my family the press release. I found out they had seen it the way I found out about most things in my family, through a text chain I was not originally included in, which my cousin Marcus screenshot and forwarded to me with the message, "I think Aunt Patricia is having a moment." The chain, 7 people, my mother, both aunts, 3 cousins, and an uncle I rarely spoke to, had apparently begun the evening the press release ran. I read it backward, the way you do when someone shows you a chain mid-conversation. The first message was from Aunt Lisa, a screenshot of the release with the words, "Is this our Nadia?" My mother had responded, "I'm calling her." Aunt Patricia's message came 11 minutes after that. It was 4 words. Well, good for her. My mother called that night. I let it go to voicemail. Then I called her back 20 minutes later, when I was home and not in the middle of anything, and she said, "I saw the news about the dinner." I said, "Yes." She said, "The governor's dinner." I said, "Yes." There was a pause. She said, "Nadia, that's quite something." I said, "Thank you, Mom. I'm really proud of the team." She said she was proud too. We talked for 12 minutes. She did not mention the job listings she had forwarded over the past 5 years. I did not mention them either. Aunt Patricia texted me the next morning. The text said, "Saw the announcement. Congratulations. If you ever need any help managing things now that they're taking off, don't hesitate." I read it twice. I set my phone face down on my desk and went back to the staffing schedule I had been building. I did not respond that day. I finished the staffing schedule. I called Rafael Domingo to confirm his start date. I reviewed the allergen protocol with Comfort. I had a call with the Heritage Hall's facilities coordinator about loading dock access. At the end of the day, I picked up my phone, opened Aunt Patricia's message, and typed, "Thank you, Aunt Patricia." I sent it. Then I put my phone in my bag and drove home. The inaugural dinner was on a Saturday in January, the kind of January the upper Midwest delivers without apology. 17 degrees at 6 in the morning when our first vehicle pulled into the Heritage Hall loading dock, the ground hard and the air sharp enough to notice on every breath. I had been awake since 4. I had not slept well the night before, but not from anxiety. Exactly. More from the particular alertness that comes when you have prepared as thoroughly as you know how to prepare, and there is nothing left to do but execute. We had 11 staff on the floor and 8 in the kitchen. Comfort ran the floor. Rafael ran the kitchen. I moved between both, which was my role on large events, not cooking, not directing service, but reading the room and the kitchen simultaneously and communicating between them. I had learned this from watching Comfort do it in the early years, when I was still the one running the floor myself and she was teaching me, quietly, how to see an event whole. The room held 307 guests by the time service began. The head table held 12, including the governor and the lieutenant governor and the chief of staff and the committee chairs. The governor's wife sat to his left. Andrea Moss was at a side table near the service corridor, visible from my position at the kitchen pass, and I watched her the way I watched all the key contacts at high-stakes events, not waiting for trouble, just keeping the channel open. Service went in 4 courses. The first course landed at 7:43, 12 minutes ahead of the program's intended pace, which gave us buffer. The second course, a composed salad with a warm grain component that required precise timing from the kitchen, went to table at 8:11. I watched a state senator reach for a second piece of bread before the salad arrived and felt the specific satisfaction of knowing the bread had been worth making from scratch. The protein course went at 8:54. The governor's parallel menu was plated identically to the main service, and the floor staff had been briefed so precisely on the table assignments that there was no visible differentiation in the delivery. I stood at the kitchen pass and watched it land. After the dessert course, during the formal remarks, Andrea Moss crossed the room toward me. She moved with purpose, the kind of walk that makes people step slightly aside without knowing why, and when she reached me, she put her hand out and said, "Ms. Osei, this was exceptional." I shook her hand. I said, "Thank you. The team executed beautifully." She said, "I want to have a conversation next week about the governor's schedule of events for the coming year." I said I would look forward to it. I drove home at 1:15 in the morning. I called Comfort from the car and told her the floor had been perfect. She said, "I know." I laughed. I drove the rest of the way home in the quiet. The press coverage ran the following week. The state's business journal ran a feature, not a brief, a feature, with a photograph of the Heritage Hall dining room set for service and a sidebar on Osei and Table's history in Briarwood. The journalist, a woman named Claire Eberhardt, who covered business and economic development, had done her background research. The piece mentioned the university contract. It mentioned the revenue trajectory. It mentioned that the company had grown from a one-person operation to a full-time staff of 7 in 5 years. It mentioned, without me having provided it, the name of the first event I had ever catered, a church reception at St. Andrew's Episcopal, 2019, 40 guests, a chicken and rice dish I had adapted from my grandmother's recipe. Claire Eberhardt had found that detail in an archived community newsletter. I do not know why it moved me the way it did, but when I read it, I put the journal down on my desk and looked at the wall for a moment. The St. Andrew's reception had paid me $340. I had driven back and forth twice because I forgot the serving spoons the first trip. The journal piece ran on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, I had received 41 messages, texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be a florist who wanted to discuss a partnership. Among the 41, a text from my cousin Diane, who said, "I literally didn't even know you were doing this. I'm so sorry I wasn't paying attention." A voicemail from my uncle David, who said, "Your father would be proud," which was the only message that required me to sit still for a moment before I could respond. A text from Aunt Lisa that said, "We always knew you had something special." An email from Aunt Patricia. Aunt Patricia's email was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph congratulated me and said the article had been very thorough. The second paragraph said she had shared it with her colleagues at the county and that everyone was very impressed. The third paragraph said that if I was ever looking to expand into government contract catering, county events, public functions, she had a few contacts who might be useful, and she would be happy to make introductions. I read the email twice. I thought about the pavilion at the Elmwood Community Center, the bread basket, the plastic cup. Cooking for strangers isn't a career plan. It's a phase. I thought about what it would mean to use Aunt Patricia's contacts, not the ethics of it. I was not angry enough to make it an ethical question. I thought about it practically, the way I thought about vendor contracts and staffing schedules. I thought about what it would introduce into the relationship between my company and any county contract, the obligation to her, the implied access she would have to something I had built entirely on my own terms. I thought about what the relationship would look like in 2 years, or 5, if I had walked through a door she held open. I wrote back 3 days later. I thanked her for the kind words. I said I was glad the article had reflected the team's work. I said that Osei and Table's current government contract pipeline was being managed by our business development lead, a slight exaggeration. Comfort and I were the business development lead, and that we were in good shape for the coming year, but I would keep her in mind. I signed off warmly. I sent it. I have not received a follow-up from Aunt Patricia since then. I don't think she processed the decline the first time she read it. That's fine. The conversation with Andrea Moss happened 10 days after the inauguration. She called rather than emailing, which I had learned to read as a signal that the conversation mattered. She told me that the governor's schedule of civic events for the calendar year included 8 formal dinners, a series of regional economic development luncheons, 12 events across 4 cities, and a summer garden reception for state agency department heads. She said the inaugural committee had been reconstituted as a standing events planning office and that they were looking to build ongoing vendor relationships rather than rebid each event. She said Osei and Table was their first call. The contract that came out of that conversation was structured across 3 years. The first year's events totaled $1.3 million in contract value. There was a renewal clause. There was a performance review benchmark. Gerald Okafor spent 4 days reviewing the documents and came back with 12 questions for Andrea's office and 3 suggested amendments, all of which were accepted. I signed on a Thursday morning at my desk in Briarwood. Comfort was there. Priya was there. She had been with me since year 2, since the rented kitchen, since the farmer's market boxes. Priya had tears in her eyes, which I noted without remarking on. I signed the final page, and I set the pen down and I said, "Okay, we have a lot of work to do." Comfort said, "We always do." She picked up her clipboard and went back to the production schedule she had been building. I hired 2 additional full-time staff that spring. I promoted Priya to Director of Culinary Operations, which was a title I had been holding in reserve for the right moment. The right moment had arrived. She accepted with a handshake and then immediately started reworking the spring menu calendar, which was exactly what I had hoped she would do. The Briarwood Business Association gave Osei and Table its Small Business of the Year award that April. The ceremony was at a hotel downtown, one of our client hotels, which added a small irony I noticed and let pass. The award was presented by the association's president, a commercial real estate developer named Gordon Yates, who had the specific energy of a person who has given this speech many times and means it every time. He read a brief citation that mentioned the inaugural dinner, the university contract, the 5-year revenue trajectory. He mentioned that the company had started with $8,000 in personal savings. I accepted the award. I thanked Gordon Yates. I thanked Comfort and Priya and the full team by name, all 9 full-time staff, in order of their start date, which I had memorized because I think the order matters.
I said one other thing.
I said, I started this company in a rented kitchen on the east side of Briarwood when I was 24 years old, and a lot of people who loved me suggested, with the best intentions, that I consider a different path. I understood why they said it. I also understood that the only way to answer that question was to keep working. So that's what I did. Gordon Yates nodded. The room applauded. I stepped back from the podium and returned to my seat. My mother was in the audience. I had told her about the award 2 weeks earlier. She had driven up from the other side of the city by herself and found her seat before I arrived, which meant she had been early, which meant she had wanted to be there. She was in the 3rd row. When I stepped back from the podium, she was clapping, and she was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, not pride exactly, or not just pride. Something more complicated, that I think included the recognition that she had been looking at the wrong picture for a long time and was only now understanding what the actual picture contained. We had dinner after the ceremony, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant she chose. She ordered carefully and ate slowly, and she said, at one point unprompted, I should have understood sooner what you were doing. I said, you did the best you could with what you could see. She put her hand over mine for a moment. We talked about other things after that. Aunt Patricia sent a card. It arrived 4 days after the ceremony, which meant she had read about it somewhere before I told her, I had not told her, and had found a card and mailed it, which is its own kind of effort. The card said, Congratulations, Nadia. We are all so proud. Inside, in her handwriting, she had added, You've really done something here.
I mean that.
I read it. I put it in the drawer of my desk where I keep documents I am not ready to throw away and am not sure what to do with. I have not called her. I have not sent a follow-up note. I am not angry. I simply find that the architecture of my life no longer has a structural place for the kind of relationship Aunt Patricia and I had for the first 30 years of my life. That's not a punishment. It's just a fact about space and time and what you build when you're not looking. Today, Osei and Table is in its 7th year. We have 15 full-time employees. We operate out of our own 4,800 square foot production facility, which we moved into 18 months ago. We hold the governor's events contract, 3 university accounts, a corporate campus account that generates 40-plus events per year, and a new line of work I did not anticipate, private foundation galas. A nonprofit director named Teresa Cho saw our work at one of the state dinners and reached out 6 months later about her organization's annual fundraiser. That event led to 2 referrals. Those 2 referrals led to 4 more. Foundation work now represents 22% of our annual revenue. Last year's revenue was $2.7 million. I paid myself a salary of $180,000. I have a retirement account. I have a business line of credit I have never needed to draw on. I have a team I trust completely, and I think they trust me, and I think we are building something that will outlast the version of it that exists right now, which is the only kind of building that has ever interested me. My father passed away 2 years ago, quietly, in the way he did most things. He had been sick for a while, and we had known it was coming, and it was still a subtraction I was not prepared for. He had come to one of the state dinners, not as a guest, just as a visitor I had arranged access for, through Andrea Moss, who made it happen without fanfare. He stood near the kitchen corridor and watched the floor service for 20 minutes. He did not say much. At one point he said, "You have a good operation." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He nodded once, the way he always did, filing it somewhere. I think he understood by then what the actual picture contained. I hope he did. I keep the framed letter from Dr. Constance Feld on the wall of my office. I keep the Briarwood Business Association award on the shelf above my desk. I do not keep the card from Aunt Patricia on display, but I have not thrown it away. There is a thing I have come to understand about the people who doubted me, and I want to say it without bitterness, because bitterness is a weight I decided a long time ago I could not afford to carry through a commercial kitchen. Aunt Patricia was not wrong that cooking for strangers is hard. She was not wrong that most small food businesses fail. She was not wrong that the path I chose carried real risk. What she was wrong about was the assumption that risk and foolishness are the same thing. What she could not see, what none of them could see, was that I had already accounted for the risk. I had looked at it directly, priced it, built contingency around it, and decided to proceed anyway. I was not ignoring the odds. I was working inside them. That is the difference between a phase and a career. A phase is something you do until the feeling fades. A career is something you build even after the feeling has been replaced by something quieter and more durable, by the specific satisfaction of a second course landing at 8:11, exactly on schedule, in a room full of people who will never know your name, but who will remember the meal. The people who love you can only see you from where they're standing. Sometimes you have to build something large enough that they can see it from where they stand. And sometimes, by the time you've built it, you realize you stopped needing them to see it a long time ago. You built it anyway because you needed to, not for them, and not even for yourself in the way you originally thought. You built it because it was the right thing to build, and you were the right person to build it, and the work itself turned out to be the answer to every question you had been asked. The approval that arrives after the proof is not the same as the belief that was there before you needed it. I understand why people offer the late version. I accept it graciously, in most cases. But I don't mistake it for the thing I actually needed, which I found elsewhere, in a rented kitchen, in a framed letter, in a team of 9 full-time employees who showed up at 4 in the morning in January without being asked twice. That is where the real validation lives. Everything else is bread for the basket. If you've carried a dream that someone you loved called a phase, if you know what it feels like to refill the bread basket and walk back to work while someone is still talking, I want you to know that the work was never wasted. Not one day of it.
Keep building.
You don't owe anyone a preview. The proof will speak when it's ready. And now I want to ask you something because I'm genuinely curious, and I think the people in this community often have the most specific, honest answers. Was there a moment, one specific moment, with a particular person in a particular room, when you realized that the approval you'd been waiting for had arrived too late to feel the way you'd imagined it would? What was that moment? Tell me in the comments. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. New stories go up every week. And if you know someone who is still in that rented kitchen season of their life, still showing up, still being told it's a phase, share this with them. I'll see you in the next one. This is an original fictional story created for entertainment purposes only. All names, characters, events, and details are invented. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is entirely coincidental.